Hey there guys, how's it going? So welcome back to my fantasy fight series. So as I've been asking you guys for suggestions for the fantasy fight series, one fight has kept popping up, and that is the fight that really should have happened between Roy Jones and Dariusz Michalczewski. Quite a few people asked me to talk about this fight, and this is a very popular one in regards to fights that never happened and fights that we like to speculate and hypothesize about. And yeah, this is one that a few people brought up in my comment section for me to talk about. So let's talk about it. So Roy Jones versus Dariusz Michalczewski. Now, this situation to me between Roy Jones and Dariusz Michalczewski was very similar to the situation that we had with Joe Calzaghe and Sven Otke. Now, I did my fantasy fight for that fight. If you want to check it out, Joe Calzaghe versus Sven Otke, and in many ways this situation sort of parallels that one in the sense that this is a fight which definitely should have happened. It was a fight that could easily have happened. It was a fight that there was a lot of public demand for. It was a fight that made perfect sense in the sense that these two were sort of unofficial rivals. You know, they were champion in the same division, in the same era. They fought many of the same opponents. There was ample opportunity for the fight to happen, but it didn't happen for one reason or another. And I'm not really here to get into why the fight didn't happen. I'm sure you guys will let me know in the comment section as to why this fight didn't happen. But nonetheless, what we're going to do here is we're going to break this fight down in regards to what would have happened if these guys had fought at their absolute prime. Now, I do consider Roy Jones' prime to be at light heavyweight, which was where both of these guys were most prominent. Um, because Roy did jump up, you know, he used to jump up and down in weight. He fought all over the place. He even fought as high as heavyweight. However, I think that light heavyweight, in my personal opinion, was Roy Jones' best weight. So these two were, of course, unified light heavyweight champions. Dariusz Michalczewski was the WBO champion for the longest point. He also, at one point in time, held the IBF and WBA belts. And in defeating Virgil Hill, he became the lineal champion. He, I believe, still to this day holds the record for consecutive title defenses at light heavyweight. He had, I believe it was 22 successful title defenses at light heavyweight, which for the light heavyweight division is a record. He also, and a lot of people don't know this, but Dariusz Michalczewski also was a cruiserweight champion. After he won the WBO title light heavyweight, his very next fight he moved up and won the cruiserweight title, and he never defended it though. He moved back down, so he was a two-division champion. Roy, of course, had world titles in multiple divisions, including the heavyweight division. So yeah, both of these guys were very well accomplished. Both of them had records in their own ways. You know, both of them were record breakers. I mean, in their own ways, in terms of their accomplishments. And it would have been a fascinating fight. Who do I think would have won this fight, and how do I think this fight will go? Well, let's talk about the styles of each guy. So, Roy Jones, everybody out there who has been watching boxing longer than 5 minutes knows about Roy Jones. You know about his accomplishments. The guy is a legend in the sport. And you know, Roy Jones. I remember when I was first getting into boxing. You know, when I was a young guy, me and my friend who sort of got me into boxing, we used to watch Roy Jones non-stop. Like I remember every single time I would be round at his house, you know, over the course of a few years, we would always watch Roy Jones fights. Um, I've got several Roy Jones fights on DVD, several highlight videos and whatnot. I remember one DVD in particular that we used to watch over and over was the Roy Jones Greatest Knockouts. You know, there was also the Roy Jones Greatest Counter Punches. You know, we had a big stack of Roy Jones DVDs. You know, loads of Roy Jones fights, loads of Roy Jones highlights, and he was a fighter who I always used to watch growing up. You know, he was a fighter who I was always somewhat fascinated by, and the thing that really made Roy Jones stand out was he had a style that was very unique to him. Basically, Roy Jones was a guy who had a absolutely outstanding level of athleticism. He had some of the best hand speed I've ever seen for a light heavyweight. I mean, that guy, he had the kind of hand speed that you see in the lightweight division. You know, despite the fact that he was very heavily muscled, and you know he had like that bodybuilder type physique, he could throw punches like absolute lightning. I always remember the clip where he threw, I think it was 4 left hooks in a row, and the commentator thought he threw like 2 left hooks, but then seeing it in slow motion, it was 4 left hooks. And Roy basically would break all the rules. He would fight with his hands down. His defense consisted of his reflexes and, of course, his offense, because he was so fast and so sharp and so quick. Nobody could really hit him when he was in his prime. And there is a lot of controversy out there, and I'm sure somebody's going to bring it up in the comment section. There's speculation out there as to how much of that was natural talent and how much of it was PEDs, because we know that Roy Jones, after I believe his fight against was it Richard Hall? I believe it was his fight against Richard Hall, if I remember rightly. I might have that wrong, but I know it was for one of his fights. I think it was the Richard Hall fight. He tested positive for PEDs after the fight. In fact, I believe both guys did, but I digress. Roy Jones definitely tested positive for PEDs in that fight, and it's pretty much common knowledge at this point. I mean, everybody knows that Roy Jones definitely in his prime was on PEDs. Now, I don't really want to get into that because personally I don't care about PEDs. I don't really think that it's worth lingering on, because in my personal opinion, I don't think there is a professional athlete alive who hasn't dabbled in PEDs. There are definitely ways around getting caught. Definitely in the the early to late 90s, it was very easy to get away with taking PEDs. I mean, Mike Tyson used to, he used to have a method for getting around piss tests. He used to use like fake urine and stuff like that. So there are definitely ways of getting around it. You can use masking agents and stuff like that. Athletes laugh off these type of drug tests that you see in America in particular, and Roy Jones definitely, without a doubt, was a PED user. But again, it's controversial as to whether how much of his talent, how much of his athletic ability was down to PEDs and how much of it was natural. But I digress. Roy Jones was definitely a phenomenal athlete, and he was a guy, like I said earlier, he would completely break all the rules. Like I said, he would have his hands down. He wouldn't really have a consistent jab. He wouldn't have a consistent guard. He would constantly just duck his head, but duck his head in front of his lead foot, which you're not supposed to do. But he used to get away with it because he was so quick. He'd put his hands behind his back and let his opponents have a shot, but then he would slip their punches and counter, and he would throw punches from weird angle. And you can definitely tell that Roy Jones inspired a lot of modern day fighters. If you look at the way that like Tyson Fury fights, for example, or the way that somebody like Gregoras Proxer fights, or even somebody like David Haye or Jean Pascal, these guys that fight with their hands down and rely on athleticism rather than fundamentals and technique. You can tell that Roy Jones definitely had an influence on these guys, but unfortunately for them, none of them were as athletic or as fast as Roy Jones. The guy was just an absolute freak athlete, and that's how he was able to get away with that type of thing. He'd be fighting somebody who was very fundamental, very well schooled. Take, for example, when he fought, I'll use for an example, somebody like Clinton Woods. If you guys remember that fight, he was a very fundamental, very well schooled fighter. And Roy went in the ring and just absolutely obliterated him by, he had his hands down, he was showboating, he was jumping around, and he was offering up free shots, sticking his chin in the air, and none of these fighters in his prime could really capitalize on it because he was just so fast and so sharp. His reflexes were so good, his hand speed was so shocking. And yeah, that was really his bread and butter, was his athletic ability. Now, when Roy Jones started to get a bit older, and when that athletic ability started to decline, and of course, as his opposition started to increase, but it's sort of a collaboration of the two things, isn't it? He was getting older, he was starting to show signs of wear and tear, and his opponents were sort of wisening up to his style. That style that he used to fight with, that reliance on reflexes and athleticism rather than fundamentals and skill, started to become more apparent, and he started to get found out. And when he no longer had that super speed and that super athleticism, he didn't really have the boxing fundamentals to fall back on. And that's why fighters like Glenn Johnson and Antonio Tarver and many other guys like Joe Calzaghe, later on in his career, like guys like Denis Lebedev and Danny Green, these guys were able to just walk Roy Jones down and get the better of him using basic boxing fundamentals, because Roy, with his declining physical attributes, wasn't able to rely on technique. He wasn't able to rely on fundamentals. And that's a good example of why his rival Bernard Hopkins was able to have so much more longevity than he did, because, Bernard Hopkins wasn't a guy who relied on athleticism. He was a guy who relied on his brain and his veteran tactics and stuff like that. And that's why when they fought in their prime, Bernard Hopkins got completely schooled by Roy Jones, because Roy was just too fast and athletic for him. However, when they were both old men, and when they fought when they were years past their prime and didn't have the same athleticism anymore, it was Bernard Hopkins who got the better of Jones, because he was able to be more well preserved by relying on skill rather than freakish athleticism. So Roy was a great fighter in his prime. However, once his physical prime started to decline, he was never able to adjust, and he was never the same again. So he basically had two versions of Roy Jones. You had the version of Roy Jones when he was young and at his best, and he was just obliterating everybody due to just superior athleticism. Then you had the older Roy, who started to decline in his athleticism, and he was basically mediocre. He became a very mediocre fighter in the second half of his career. Now, Dariusz Michalczewski, although he does have some similarities to Roy in the sense that he was a light heavyweight champion, very talented fighter, he was completely different to Roy stylistically, a complete contrast. Dariusz Michalczewski was a very fundamental fighter. He was a guy who was very well schooled, did everything right. He came from that Eastern European style of boxing where everything is off the jab, everything's fundamental, nice, stiff, hard, straight punches, hold the center of the ring, good balance. He was just a very, very well schooled fighter. Dariusz Michalczewski, of course, as you'll know, he was a Polish fighter who was based in Germany. The vast majority of his career he fought in Germany, and many people cite that as a reason why the fight didn't happen against Roy, because Roy didn't want to go to Germany. And depending on who you ask, Dariusz Michalczewski didn't want to go to America, but again, we can get into that in another video. Dariusz Michalczewski was the type of fighter who, he was a lot more workmanlike than Roy. I've talked about how Roy was just such a freak athlete. Like, he could go in against a guy like Virgil Hill and he could just blow him away in 4 rounds using his speed and his athleticism and his power and that awkward, difficult to attune to style that he had. It would be very difficult to train and spar for somebody like Roy Jones. Whereas Dariusz Michalczewski, like I said, he's a lot more workmanlike. When he fought some of the same opponents that Roy did, he was never as visually impressive against these guys. Like when he fought Virgil Hill, he beat Virgil Hill on points. He pretty much dominated the whole fight, but he did so in very workmanlike fashion. Just basic boxing fundamentals: hold the center of the ring, stiff jab, outwork him, outland him, and beat him pretty comfortably on points. He also beat Montel Griffin, who was the guy who took away Roy Jones's undefeated record. Roy was, of course, life and death with Montel Griffin in that fight, having a lot of problems. However, Roy ended up dropping him and then hitting him multiple times while he was on the canvas and getting himself disqualified. When Dariusz Michalczewski fought Montel Griffin, that was a competitive fight for a few rounds. However, in the 4th round, Michalczewski started to piece Montel Griffin up, and then the referee stopped the fight. There was controversy with that. A lot of people think it was a premature stoppage. It definitely was. Interestingly enough, though, the referee for that fight was Joe Cortez. So yeah, he was an American referee, and he stopped Dariusz Michalczewski. Sorry, he stopped Montel Griffin prematurely against Dariusz Michalczewski, and that was a weird one. But either way, I do think Michalczewski would have stopped him because he had him out on his feet and he was getting ready to do him in. So, yeah, I do think he would have stopped Montel Griffin anyway. Dariusz Michalczewski also fought Mark Prince. You guys might remember him. He was an undefeated contender from the UK. I've got that fight on my channel, actually, and yeah, Dariusz Michalczewski absolutely battered him, broke him down. I believe he knocked him out it was the 7th round, I think. So, yeah, I'm going off memory when I do these videos, by the way. Like you guys all know that when I do these fight breakdowns, I don't have any material in front of me. I'm not actually on the internet at the moment, so I'm not like sitting in front of BoxRec or anything. So I'm just going by what I can remember from fights of these guys that I've personally watched. And so if I get any of the dates mixed up, or if I get some of the opponents' names wrong, I apologise. But my point is that these two fought a lot of the same opponents, and they had varying results. Like I said, Michalczewski did a better job in his fight against Montel Griffin than Roy did in the first fight against Montel Griffin. In the second fight, Roy blew him away in 1 round, but the first fight, Montel Griffin gave Roy a lot of problems and exposed a lot of his flaws. Virgil Hill, of course, Roy did a far better job. That fight was at a catch weight, and Virgil Hill was maybe a little bit past it then, but Roy destroyed him in 4 rounds, sparked him with a body shot, and Michalczewski beat him on points in pretty workmanlike fashion. Now, one thing that I've heard from the Roy Jones side of things, I've heard people say that Roy Jones would have easily beaten Michalczewski because Michalczewski lost to Gonzalez. However, that fight was, and this is one thing that I think a lot of people need to pay attention to, because you really need to, when you're citing why an opponent loses to somebody, or why they lose to a particular opponent, you have to take into consideration the parameters and the manner of the defeat, as well as the timing of the defeat. When Michalczewski lost to Gonzalez, that was at the very end of his career, when he was on the verge of retirement. Not only that, but it was also a controversial decision. Going into that fight, Michalczewski was 48-0, I believe, and he was on the verge of tying Rocky Marciano's record. And some people believe that the powers that be in boxing didn't want that to happen, and that was why he didn't get the decision in that fight. But again, we're getting into conspiracy territory here. But from what I saw in that fight, I definitely thought that Michalczewski won. It was a competitive fight, but I thought he did enough to win, and so did most people. So I don't think we can say that losing to Gonzalez right near the end of his career, and then because Roy was able to beat Gonzalez easily, I don't think that we can really look at that and use that as definitive proof to say that Roy would have had no trouble with Michalczewski. Likewise, if we were to say that Glenn Johnson, who's a pretty basic pressure fighter, was able to just walk down and break down and knock Roy Jones out cold, I mean, you have to take into consideration the timing of that defeat. That happened after Roy had moved down from heavyweight and had already been knocked out by Antonio Tarver. So how much stock can you really put in that? That's the point I'm trying to make. These sort of triangle theories don't really work when you put them into theory, into practice, because you have to take into consideration so many variables. So I don't really think that by looking at the same opponents they fought, it would be easy to ascertain who would win the fight. I think the best way to look at who would win this fight is to just look at the style of the two guys and how they would match up. So here's how I think this fight would go. You've got Roy, who's obviously got the quicker hands. Roy, who is the more athletic of the two, much faster, much quicker, probably the bigger puncher too, more explosive, got a more unorthodox style. And then you've got Dariusz Michalczewski, who's a very fundamental fighter, guy with a great jab, good at walking his opponents down, just chipping away at them and a little bit workmanlike, but also a pretty big puncher. I think that how this fight would go is I think it would be competitive. I think it would be, and this is of course assuming it's both guys at their peak. I'm not saying, like, imagine if it's Michalczewski from the Gonzalez fight versus Roy Jones from his prime, and I'm not saying it's like Roy Jones from where he fought Denis Lebedev against Michalczewski from his prime, because obviously we know the results in that case. I'm going to assume that this is both guys at their absolute peak, so when they were at the peak of their careers. I'm going to say that this fight would be competitive. I think it would be back and forth. I think it may be in some ways reminiscent of the Jones versus Hopkins fight, where maybe Jones is winning the rounds, but Michalczewski will be holding his own, just chipping forward, maybe getting the odd jab in here and there, maybe making it hard for Roy, making Roy work. I think that the fight would more than likely go the distance. Michalczewski had a pretty good chin in his prime. He was only stopped once, and that was in his very last fight where he came out of retirement and fought for the title. And he was obviously out of shape and past his prime. But other than that, he was never stopped. Roy Jones, of course, didn't get stopped until he started to slow down in the latter part of his career. So I don't think it's very likely that this fight would end in a stoppage. I think it would likely go the distance. And I think that if I was to pick a winner here, I would pick Roy Jones to win this fight by a very close decision. I think the reason why is because you would have Michalczewski, very fundamental, basic jab, coming forward, trying to impose his will on Jones. And I think that Jones would catch him on the way in with some of those weird uppercuts and weird hooks that he would throw from weird angles. And I think that Roy's showmanship and the little things that he does, the little nuances with some of the things he does, where he knows how to play the crowd and he knows how to sort of nick rounds, because that's one thing that Roy was pretty good at, is being able to nick rounds by just being faster and more flashy. So say if the fight was in America, I definitely think Roy would be getting the rounds. Now if the fight were in Germany, where Michalczewski was more favoured, it might be harder for Roy to win the rounds that way. He may have to work a little bit harder, but I still think he could beat Michalczewski. I just think that the difference in speed, the difference in athleticism, the more flashy combinations that Roy would throw, the more eye-catching punches that he would land, by comparison, would probably lead to Roy being favoured on the scorecards. So I think Roy Jones would probably win this fight. And I think he would probably win the fight on points. That's what I'm going to say. I'm going to go for Roy Jones by a very close unanimous decision. That's how I see this fight going. I think it's an interesting fight. I think it's a fight that I'd give Dariusz Michalczewski a puncher's chance, because he was a big puncher. And Roy was never had the best chin. Roy was always chinny, I think. It's just that in his prime, nobody could catch him because he was so sharp. So I would give Michalczewski a puncher's chance. I think there's more chance of him scoring the knockout than there is Roy scoring the knockout. But I think Roy would be more than likely to win on points in the fight. I think Roy was just too fast. I think he would do the same thing to Michalczewski as what he did to Bernard Hopkins, in my opinion. I think it would be a similar sort of fight. And I think that he would win the fight on points by just being more flashy and more eye-catching. So that's how I see this one. Roy Jones by unanimous decision. Let me know what you guys think. That's my fantasy fight for this one done. I know I kind of went off on a tangent with this one, but it was an interesting one to talk about, I think. And yeah, I think it would have been a great fight. And it's a shame this fight never happened. But yeah, I think Roy would have won on points. That's how I see it. So let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching. God bless.